Hey everybody, this is chapter 5, not chapter 5, section 5 of chapter 2 of Marx Worldwide on the Development of the International Discourse on Marx since 1965 by Jan Hoff. Chapter 2 of this book is titled The Further Development of the Marx Debate Since the 1960s, a Survey. And section 5 of chapter 2 is titled Italy, France, and Other Western European Countries. Italy, France, Other Western European Countries. The section 1 of section 5 is titled Italy. As far as the Western European discussion of Marx is concerned, the discourses in Italy and France constitute the most important points of reference, if by no means the only ones. Within the present framework, however, the discussion in Italy and France can only be considered selectively. Thus, the whole range of the extremely variegated and theoretically rich history of Italian Marxism from the post-war period to the recent past, encompassing thinkers such as Ludovico Monat, Sebastiano Timpanaro, and Gianfranco Lagrassa, cannot be presented here. Rather, attention is focused on a few of the authors who have distinguished themselves with their interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy and have gained a certain international prominence as a result. Footnote: the sequence in which the authors presented in this chapter are considered is not always a chronological one. And footnote: the philosophers Galvano della Volpe and Lucio Coletti, both of whom have already been mentioned above, exerted a decisive influence on the Italian Marx discussion of the post-war period. Among other questions, the clarification of Marx's relation to Hegel played an important role for both of these philosophers. The following can be considered central aspects of Della Volpe's reception of Marx's theory: the insistence on the specific scientific character of Marx's thought, and on the latter's break with Hegel's philosophy, and particularly the interpretation of Marxian abstraction as a, quote, determinate abstraction that stands opposed to Hegelian abstraction. Della Volpe conceived of Marx's method as a movement from the concrete to the abstract, and then back from the abstract to the concrete. Generally speaking, Della Volpe is to be credited within Italian Marxism for having considerably contributed to the process whereby a methodologically oriented Marx reading could establish itself in the post-war period. The emergence of the Della Volpe school in the 1950s marked a watershed in the history of Italian Marxism, in particular with regard to the systematic engagement with Marxian theory that was brought to the fore by Della Volpe. So there's a number of footnotes here. An introduction to Della Volpe's methodological engagement with Marx, which goes into the historical circumstances in which Della Volpe's thought developed, is given in Montano, 1971. And footnote. Martin J. devotes much attention to both Della Volpe and Coletti in his well-known study Marxism in Totality, published in 1984. Ingo Elba gives a detailed consideration of Coletti in Elba 2010. And footnote. On earlier discussion of Marx in Italy, see Bravo 1989. On Italian editions of Marx and Engels up to 1926, see Gianni 2007. On editions of Marx and Engels after the Second World War, see Bravo 1992. See Corradi 2005 for a comprehensive work dealing in detail with the history of Italian Marxism from the late 19th century, from Labriola to the recent past via Gramsci, the post-war Marxism of the Della Volpe school, and Apparismo. On Italian Marxism in the 20th century, see also Bellafiore, 2007. A perspective on the history of Italian Marxism is also given by Costanzo Preve. For Preve's interpretation of Marx, see among other works Preve 1984 and 2007. It is not possible within the present framework to go into Preve's political conceptions. And footnote. Alongside Lucio Coletti, Niccolao Merker, and others, the philosopher Mario Rossi deserves mention as one of the best-known theorists to have come from this school. And footnote. Footnote. It goes without saying, however, that Della Volpe's thematically multifaceted work cannot be reduced to his reception of Marx in the narrow sense. End footnote. Following its publication in 1950, Della Volpe's important philosophical work, Logica com Scienza Positiva, gradually gained influence. Lucio Coletti has since claimed that Marx's theory, and above all Marx's Capital, only exerted a rather slight influence on the intellectual life of the Italian left until around 1950 or 1956. Coletti formulates the point as follows. Quote, "The essential lesson I learned from contact with the writings of Della Volpe was the need for an absolutely serious relationship to the work of Marx, based on direct knowledge and real study of his original texts. This may sound paradoxical, but it's important to remember that the penetration of Marxism into Italy in the first post-war decade, from 1945 to 1955, was intellectually and theoretically very superficial and exiguous." Unquote. I don't know what exiguous means, so if you know what exiguous means, you have my salute. Whether or not Coletti's assessment is held to be accurate, it remains the case that an important step in the direction of a more intensive reception of Marxian theory was taken in the 1950s. In this context, Della Volpe's reading of Marx will now be considered more closely. There is an important similarity between Della Volpe's interpretation of Marx and that of Louis Althusser. Both philosophers insist on an irreconcilable theoretical difference between Hegel and Marx. Both Della Volpe and Althusser considered that the development of Marxist thought was marked by a radical, quote, break or, quote, turning point that had a decisive effect on the latter's theoretical work. Nevertheless, an important distinction ought not to be overlooked. Here, these two thinkers locate the decisive break in Marx's work from the point of view of this work's genesis or formation at different chronological points. Althusser dates Marx's break with his earlier, quote, humanistic or, quote, ideological thought in 1845 at the earliest, and argues that the theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology document his rupture. By contrast, Marx's 1843 critique of Hegel's doctrine of the state already marks his decisive break, i.e. with Hegel. It might be added here that this implies a completely different evaluation of Marx's thought in the period between 1843 and 1845 on the part of Della Volpe and Althusser respectively. The dimensions of this difference become apparent if the great significance of the year 1844 in particular, the evaluation of which is so fiercely contested by Della Volpe and Althusser, is borne in mind. 1844 is the year in which Marx crucially intensified his engagement with political economy, after which there would be no going back as far as this new field of theoretical work was concerned. Incidentally, it is not only in the comparison between Della Volpe and Althusser that differences, beyond superficial similarities, should be borne in mind. This also applies to the comparison between Della Volpe and a further philosopher whose work inspired the formation of a school of thought and who also emphasizes the decisive significance of a break in Marx's work, namely the Japanese theorist and interpreter of Marx, Wataru Hiromatsu. The latter, whose approach focuses on the theory of reification, also dates the break in Marx's thought as occurring at a later point than that identified by Della Volpe. Through his translations and interpretations of Marx's writings from 1843 and 1844, Galvano Della Volpe succeeded in familiarizing the Italian public with this phase in the history of the development of Marx's work. Della Volpe attributed a decisive significance to precisely this period within Marx's process of development. Here, according to the Italian philosopher, Marx laid the foundations for a new methodology, which contrasted with the Hegelian one. In Della Volpe's conception, however, the critique of Hegel's doctrine of the state of 1843 was even more important than the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Yet the Italian philosopher in no way restricted himself to concentrating on Marx's early writings before 1848. In particular, his study of the 1857 Introduction played a crucial role in the shaping of his perspective on Marx's understanding of his method. Della Volpe regarded the methodological movement from the concrete to the abstract, and then back to the concrete, as having been thematized in the Introduction and applied in Marx's Capital. Like Della Volpe, another philosopher, Lucio Coletti, who was influenced by the former and had his origins in the Della Volpe school, also proposed an anti-Hegelian interpretation of Marx. In the 1970s, Coletti's further theoretical development, based on a new reading of Marx, became manifest. For Coletti's interpretation of Marx, Kant's philosophy represented an important point of reference. He drew a fundamental distinction between, quote, dialectical contradiction and, quote, opposition devoid of contradiction, end quote. The latter being understood in the sense of the Kantian real opposition, bracket, real opposition or real repugnance, end bracket, and being completely compatible with the principle of non-contradiction. For Coletti, the principle of non-contradiction was a basic axiom of materialism and science. Quote, reality cannot contain dialectical contradictions, but only real oppositions, conflicts between forces, relations of contrariety. The latter are ohne Widerspruch, i.e. non-contradictory oppositions and not dialectical contradictions, end quote. Coletti. Yet Coletti maintains that for the mature Marx, the oppositions in capitalist society were dialectical contradictions and not mere real oppositions. An important point to note is that in the course of his disengagement from Della Volpe, Coletti revised the latter's thesis of Marx as a scientist who corresponded to the paradigm set by Galileo Galilei, and now established a distinction between a scientific discourse and a kind of, quote, philosophical discourse in Marx. Consequently, Coletti saw in the mature Marx a thinker with two different faces. Coletti's image of Marx had been shaken. Finally, the Italian thinker turned his back on Marx and Marxism. Yet Coletti was by no means the only one within the Italian reception of Marx to reflect upon Marx's, quote, two faces. The economist, Claudio Napoleoni, distinguished himself as one of the most significant Italian interpreters of the critique of political economy in the 1960s and 1970s, and drew a distinction between two different discourses in connection with Marx's critique of political economy, in a way not dissimilar to Coletti's central thesis. Napoleoni argued that Marx developed, on the one hand, a philosophical discourse. In this context, Marx crucially transcended the problems posed by traditional economic science. On the other, according to Napoleoni, Marx's, quote, other discourse, his economic one, found itself more or less in continuity with classical political economy. On the Italian economist's view, both discourses were present in Marx's deliberations on the theory of value. Footnote. On Napoleoni, see among other works, Potier in 1889, Riccardo Bellafiore also gives a consideration of Napoleoni. Bellafiore's essay is dedicated to the Italian debate on Marx's theory of value, particularly in the 1970s. Space does not permit a consideration of the details of this debate or of Napoleoni's process of development in individual theoretical questions. Further relevant references in the present context are Napoleoni 1975 and Napoleoni 1983. End footnote. It goes without saying that the Marx debate of the 1950s to the 1970s was in no way limited to the trio of Della Volpe, Coletti, and Napoleoni. For instance, Della Volpe influenced Italian economist and interpreter of Marx, Giulio Pietranera, posed the question in the 1950s of the difference between Marx's method and that of classical political economists. Footnote. A volume edited by Franco Cassano gives an overview of the discussion on Marx and Marxism that took place in Italy from the 1950s to the 1970s. It is not possible within the limits of the present subchapter to reflect the individual facets of the discussion documented in Cassano's volume. On Italian Marxism in the 1960s, see also Battelloni, 1971. And footnote. For instance, the Della Volpe influenced Italian given a context in which there had long been a much more intensive reception of the first volume of Marx's Capital than of the second and third volumes, it is worth noting that in the 1950s, Pietranera was instrumental in broadening interest in Marx's critique of political economy beyond the engagement with the first volume of Capital alone. In the 1970s, the Della Volpe influenced philosopher Mario Rossi produced a study in the history of philosophy, Da Hegel a Marx, in which he dealt extensively with the development of Marx's thought up to 1848, including reflections on the economic and philosophical manuscripts, first published in the interwar period, and the German ideology. Footnote. The Mexican interpreter of Marx, Raul Rojas, even writes the following, quote, "The second and third volumes of Capital never achieved the popularity of the first volume. The only people who were eager to obtain a copy of the final 2 volumes of Capital were professional economists. By contrast, workers and political activists never attached any great significance to the second and third volumes of Capital. From a historical perspective, it was only the first volume of Capital that was read, even though Marx himself always emphasized that his Capital formed a theoretical whole. It was never read accordingly," end quote. Raul Rojas. End footnote. A significant post-war interpreter in Italy was the philosopher Cesare Luperini, who attempted to supersede Galvano della Volpe's methodological interpretation. To the latter's interpretation of the Marxian method as a movement first from the concrete to the abstract and then back to the concrete, Luperini contraposed a conception of the trajectory of Marxist thought which begins with the abstract and ends with the abstract. In his essay, La logica specifica del oggetto specifico, he relied on Marx's postface to the second edition of the first volume of Capital. Here Marx addresses his own method and includes considerations of its relation to Hegel. The corresponding passage from the postface is, on Luperini's view, to be interpreted literally and analytically. According to the Italian philosopher, Marx had identified the rational kernel from Hegel's dialectic and extracted it from its mystical shell. Thus, the critical peculiarity of the dialectic, which reveals itself in this core, consists in the circumstance that the positive understanding through the dialectic of the existing status quo simultaneously contains the understanding of the negation of this status quo. Yet Marx left an important point incomplete. According to Luperini, as is well known, Marx recognized in his postface that Hegel had been, quote, "the first to present the dialectic's general forms of motion in a comprehensive and conscious manner," end quote. Marx. For Luperini, however, the following problem arises in this context. If, quote, "one proceeds from the starting point of the rational kernel, how are the general forms of motion to be reconstructed in the dialectic, which has been turned the right way up?" It has to be said immediately that Marx never solved this problem. That is, he never filled the gap between the, quote, "rational kernel" and the, quote, "general form of motion," end quote, of dialectic, end quote. Luperini. Yet Marx did have a feeling for the problem, according to Luperini, who poses the following question, quote, "If the dialectic has been turned the right way up and demystified, can its, quote, general forms of motion," end quote, continue to exist in the same way as in Hegel? Can they continue to exist at all? To put it another way, can they, or a modified configuration of them, be set out in a categorical continuum, i.e. systematically, on the terrain of materialist dialectic, end quote? At any rate, according to Luperini, Marx left behind a theoretical void. With regard to the Italian reception of Marx in the post-war period, it should be borne in mind, however, that important texts by Marx only became available in Italian at a late stage. If the details provided by Umberto Cerrone are correct, the third volume of Marx's Capital and Theories of Surplus Value were not published in Italian until the 1950s, and the Grundrisse did not appear in Italian until 1968 to 1970. Footnote: the so-called Fragment on Machines from the Grundrisse, which was a reference point for Aperista theoretical production, was published in Italian translation in 1964 in Quaderni Rossi. Examples of the Italian reception of the Grundrisse are to be found in Rovati, 1973, and Schiavone, 1976. A closer examination of the reception of the Grundrisse in Italy is given in Tronti, 2008. End footnote. These thematic fields are, of course, also present in the German discussion. Luperini was one interpreter who paid a great deal of attention to the, quote, beginning of the critique of political economy, i.e. Marx's analysis of the commodity, his analysis of the value form, and his exposition of the exchange process. In his reading, Luperini understands the value objectivity of commodities, an objectivity which is, according to Marx, a spectral, supersensuous one, as a purely social dimension. Towards the end of the 1970s, the Marx researcher Alberto Gajano, I'm not sure how to say it in Italian, the J's in Italian, Alberto Gajano published an investigation into Marx's commodity analysis in which he relied systematically on the first chapter of A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy. With regard to Marx's method, Gajano distinguished between an analytic moment and a synthetic genetic one. In the 1970s and 1980s, some interpretations emerged within Italian research on Marx's theory of value, which implied a certain similarity with the approach of economists such as Ian Steedman, who himself was influenced by the neo-Ricardian economist Piero Sraffa. From the latter's approach, Steedman inferred the redundancy of Marx's labor theory of value. The status of Marx's labor theory of value was also critically called into question by Italian interpreters. The Italian reception of Marx yielded an interpretation of Marx's theory of value that was also received internationally, namely the monograph by the economist Marco Lippi. Lippi's approach moved in the direction of a possible disengagement from Marx's labor theory of value. Another study which pointed in a similar direction was that by Massimo Mugnai. The latter also provided an elucidation of Marx's concept of contradiction and thematized the relationship between Marxian and Hegelian dialectic. Furthermore, a great deal of attention within the Italian debate was paid to the problematic of fetishism within Marx's critique of political economy. In the 1970s, the philosopher Alessandro Mazzone engaged with the problematic of capital fetishism and ideology theory. Footnote: Mazzone subsequently engaged in research into the specific temporality of the capitalist mode of production and into Marx's concept of class. End footnote. With regard to the problematic of fetishism, which was discussed in both Italy and Germany, Alfonso M. Iacano presented an approach in the 1980s which broadened the debate to include the question of the background of the sources for Marx's concept of fetishism. Iacano refers to the reception by Marx of an ethnological study by Schroel de Bros from 1760, entitled Du Culte du Fétiche. More recently, Franco Soldani pursued an approach to the interpretation of Marx, which has from time to time been neglected in the history of the reception of the critique of political economy. Like the South Korean Sung Won Han or the Swiss working group around Judith Yonoska, Soldani demonstrates an appreciation of the fact that Marx critically engaged with the natural science of his time. The Italian interpreter of Marx inquires as to the stimulus that Marx might have gained from this engagement with natural science. According to Soldani, aspects of the rationality characterizing natural science were reflected in Marx, firstly in the shape of his differentiation between the immanent laws of capitalist production from their form of manifestation as the coercive laws of competition, and secondly, in the guise of the, quote, difference between the, quote, internal organization, end quote, of this society and its topical, quote, modes of existence, end quote, in the phenomena or Erscheinungsformen of economic life, end quote. Soldani. The Mega 2 edition has been a focus of attention in Italy for a considerable time. In part, this has also been the case vis-a-vis a broader readership through the theoretical journals Marxismo Oggi and Critica Marxista. The attention paid to the Mega 2 edition in Italy is also attested to by, among other publications, a volume edited by Alessandro Mazzone in 2002, in which German, Italian, and U.S. authors inform an Italian readership about the history of the Mega 2 edition and the restructuring and continuation of the project after the transition to Eastern Europe, but also about the debate within the German language engagement with Marx's theory of value. Footnote: Musto outlines the contents of the Mega 2 volume 3/9, but also gives his perspective on the history of prehistory of the Mega 2 edition. Fineschi also goes briefly into the Mega 2 edition within the context of an essay of his on the Hegel-Marx relation. In addition, an interview of the Mega 2 editors Manfred Neuhaus and Gerald Hubman, carried out by Fineschi, was published in Marxismo Oggi, 2007. Most recently, Musto has given another view of the Mega 2 edition in Musto 2007b. End footnote. Footnote. In this volume, see Finesci's contribution to the German discussion of value theory in the 1970s and 1980s. Footnote: see Finesci 2008 and Bellafiore and Finesci 2009 for further examples of Italian scholarly reinterpretation of Marx in the light of the Mega 2 edition. The latter volume also contains contributions by a number of international exponents of Marxist theory. End footnote. For some time now, Riccardo Bellafiore and Roberto Finelli have ranked among the best-known representatives of a methodological discussion on Marx which has continued to be variegated. Bellafiore and Finelli regard the circle of presupposition and posit in the logic of Marx's exposition of the Critique of Political Economy as a decisive point of reference. That which is presupposed, which forms the starting point of the exposition, reveals itself in the course of the exposition of economic categories as posited. Bellafiore and Finelli developed the point as follows, quote, at the beginning of Capital, abstract labor is hypothetically, quote, repurposed, but in the course of the 3 volumes of Capital, abstract labor turns out to be the, quote, posit of capitalist labor, that is, of, quote, labor that is opposed to capital, end quote, or wage labor, end quote. Bellafiore and Finelli. Neither Bellafiore nor Finelli, indeed Finesci, subscribed to the strictly, quote, anti-Hegelian reception of Marx by probably the 2 best-known Italian interpreters in the post-war period, Della Volpe and Coletti. Bellafiore and Finelli identify an important, quote, Bellafiore and Finelli identify an important, quote, Hegelian legacy, end quote, in Marx's logic in Capital. At any rate, the elucidation of Marx's relation to Hegel remains a traditional question in the Italian debate, even after the theoretical interventions by Della Volpe and Coletti. Indeed, the Hegel-Marx relation is a central focus of a recent work by Finesci. A study by Finesci from 2002 revolves around the question of the logical and historical in Marx's critique of political economy, and more precisely with regard to the problematic of the analysis of the value form and the exposition of the exchange process. Finesci's approach implies an understanding of the, quote, historical moment in Marx's development of money in Marx's Capital itself in a, quote, logical sense. Finesci writes that, quote, a critical engagement with the traditional distinction between the, quote, historical and the, quote, logical is possible on the basis of his interpretation of Marx. Quote, under these definitions, it is possible to understand 2 different levels of the logic that is immanent within the concept of the commodity rather than a relationship of opposition, end quote. Finesci. Roberto Finesci has recently published an important contribution to research on Marx's concept of capital. In the questions it poses, this study is reminiscent of the German language discussion around the different levels of abstraction in Marx's critique of political economy, or on the respective plans that Marx drafted for such a critique. With regard to Marx's exposition, Finesci distinguishes 4 levels of abstraction corresponding to the concept of capital. The level, quote, 0, namely the level of abstraction of simple circulation, the level of the universality of capital, the level of the particularity of capital, finally the most concrete level of abstraction, which is that of the singularity of capital. In this context, Finesci argues, it is clear that Marx draws on Hegel's logic of the concept. Finesci takes it that Marx maintained a structural division in his theory of capital between universality, particularity, and singularity corresponding to the Hegelian triad throughout the historical development and elaboration of his work on the critique of political economy, i.e. from the Grundrisse right up to and including Capital. Finesci points out, however, that in further developing his theory, Marx undertook modifications with regard to the respective scope of the universality, of the particularity and the singularity of capital, and also to the respective elements of the transition between these. Thus, according to Finesci, the problematic of accumulation, which Marx originally located on the level of abstraction corresponding to particularity, was finally assigned to the level corresponding to universality. Furthermore, the Italian theorist maintains that Marx gave up his original intention to locate capital as unity, or capital as a whole, on this latter level of abstraction and to ascribe many capitals to the level of particularity rather than to that of universality. By contrast, in Marx's later manuscripts, the plurality of capitals appears already at the level of universality, even if Marx still abstracts from competition at this level. Fineschi identifies a change in Marx's approach within the formative process of his critique of political economy. Quote, if at the beginning Marx tried to apply Hegel's scheme to a given matter, to put it in order, going on he understood that the very theory of capital could be worked out only following its own inner logic. That's why changes occurred, and that's why the final structure is more dialectic and consistent than the original one. End quote. Fineschi. A remarkable feature of the Italian reception of Marx and of Marxism is the favorable situation regarding the translation of foreign research contributions. Important works of foreign research have been long available in Italian. From the Soviet Union, at least two studies by Vitaly Vygotsky and one by Evald Ilyankov, alongside Isaac Illich Rubin's Essays on Marxist Theory of Value. From both German states, studies by Hans-Georg Backhaus, Helmut Reichelt, and Walter Tuchscherer, and from German-speaking exile, Roman Rosdolsky's major work. It can thus be inferred that the knowledge of standard works from, among others, the German and Russian-speaking spheres, represents part of the background to the Italian discussion. It is nonetheless above all homegrown approaches, such as those by Della Volpe, Coletti, Napoleoni, Luperini, and other Italian interpreters of Marx's critique of political economy, that have been central within the Italian Marx discourse of the last decades. However, it is also the case that the Italian and French engagements with Marx have mutually inspired one another, with the discussion in each country being followed attentively in the other. New section, France. It must be emphasized with regard to the French debate that it is not possible within the present framework to give a comprehensive presentation of the history of post-war French Marxism as a whole, in the same way that a corresponding exposition was not feasible in the Italian case. Given even a debate as important as the French one on the principal significance of dialectic, a discussion which was carried out between Jean-Paul Sartre, Roger Garaudy, Jean Hippolyte, and others, with which German speakers soon became acquainted, cannot be gone into here. Instead, a few insights will be given into various approaches within the debate around questions of methodology and social theory in Marx's critique of political economy, with a particular focus on the way in which this debate has developed since the 1960s in particular. The first French edition of the first volume of Capital appeared while Marx was still alive and was indeed edited by Marx himself. It should thus come as no surprise that the French reading of Marx's Capital has a long tradition. After the Second World War, this was able to develop more strongly than at any time previously. Marx's Capital and his theory of value were already discussed in the years shortly after the war. In the post-war period, a tendency within the French interpretation of Marx went by the self-description, quote, Marxology. This term was also used in the GDR, although here it was not a self-description. It was rather employed with polemical undertones to characterize parts of the, quote, Western Marx discussion. The post-war current of French Marxology is particularly associated with the scientific work of Maximilien Rouvel. Rouvel was one of the first authors in the, quote, West to carry out research into the Grundrisse, and in fact, Rouvel did so before this manuscript was first made available to a wider, quote, Western circle of readers through the 1953 East German edition. I just read, it'll be up, I don't know about this time, but I have a piece by Bruno Bongiovanni on Maximilien Rouvel. There's also a secondary source on Rouvel by Kevin B. Anderson of Marxist humanist fame. I don't know if fame's the right word, but that's the Dunayevskaya Marxist humanist tradition in the United States. Is what he's associated with. So I've read the Bruno Bongiovanni one. It was very good, and I'm looking forward to reading the Kevin B. Anderson's one. Anyway, Rouvel was one of the first authors in the... Where am I? In an essay published in 1950, at approximately the same time that Korsch and Rosdolsky were engaged in depths with the Grundrisse in their respective American exiles, and at a time when this manuscript was still largely unknown, at least outside the Soviet Union, Rubel devoted his attention to a number of themes in this manuscript, one of which was the chapter on money. Rubel was one of the first people, one of the big people to, well, not the first, but to emphasize really the libertarian and anarcho-communist dimension of Marx's work, anti-state, anti-market character, which is I think is tremendous. Rubel wrote this really good book with John Crump of the Socialist Party of Great Britain, the impossibilist socialist party in Great Britain, called Non-Market Socialism, which goes through all the different iterations of non-market socialism that have kind of like been present, which were a minority, I would say a minority in the 20th century. Even if people were kind of like talked about the anarchy of the market and stuff, they didn't really talk about like, it wasn't particularly cleared or made like a principal point of being like non-market. Or in practice, it was also wasn't non-market. So Rubel and John Crump have this tremendous, I think it's John Crump, have this tremendous book, Non-Market Socialism, which I couldn't recommend to enough people. Maximilien Rubel kicks ass. And it's a shame that Althusser was so much more influential, seems to have been so much influential and had so much more of a stink made about him than Rubel. Very interesting whole history there. I think that one of the most interesting things that, I don't speak French, but it seems like one of the tasks, one of the most cool things in like the history of ideas is kind of like the libertarian socialist milieu in France between say 1968, between like 1945 and 1968. So Socialisme ou Barbarie, but also the Anarchist Federation, Rubel, No Van of Vietnamese, French Council Communist. All these people, a lot of people who were like expats, I think, from both. I think there's a lot of expats in France at this time, both from like Franco's Spain, like anarchists from Franco's Spain, but also like anarchists and others from Italy. So people who are either like Bourdieuist or post-Bourdieuist. That's how Bourdieuism kind of spread to like communization theory was in like the French scene. So it's like a whole thing that would be like super fascinating if I had more knowledge of French, just to be able to like dig into these sources and kind of do that. Certain people do the work on that. Like people do work on Socialisme ou Barbarie, or have done it at least. And then also, what's his name? I think it's David Barry, working on Daniel Guérin in France at this time. Just that whole circle, and I'd like to know more about their relationships, because I know they wrote in like the same publications, Noir et Rouge, Argument, and so forth. Super fascinating stuff. Anyway, where the hell am I? I got excited there. Footnote. At around the same time as Rubel, Auguste Cornu also undertook research in Marxian theory. Cornu moved to what would become the GDR after the Second World War. Cornu was a French Marx scholar who was like of a Stalinist variety and moved to the GDR. That's my understanding of Auguste Cornu, at least. Anyway, moving on. At the beginning of the 1960s, Maurice Godelier presented Beginning in the 1960s, Maurice Godelier presented methodological investigations into Marx's Capital. Footnote. See Godelier 2012 for a further methodologically oriented engagement with Marx's Capital in the 1960s. A further methodologically oriented engagement with Capital in the 1960s was that undertaken by Pierre Neuville. I'm not really sure about who Pierre Neuville is. I think I know he's like a Trotskyist of some variety, or was a Trotskyist of some variety. I think he might have been influenced in some capacity by surrealism in capacity, and somehow like some of the insights of surrealism kind of like came into his sociology. I think there's like a certain trend within social sciences to kind of like draw on surrealism. Obviously, I don't really know the significance of that particularly well. That's another thing that's fucking interesting, related to just what I was just talking about, is the sort of relationship, the politics of surrealism. Because, like, for instance, the initiator of surrealism, the person who kind of like drafted the manifesto, at least, or I think he just wrote the manifesto, André Breton, was a communist, then a Trotskyist. But then I think, along with other people that were kind of surrealists, like Benjamin Péret, who was, I can't remember his, like, I don't know if that's his actual name or if that's like a nom de plume or whatever, but who worked in collaboration with Grandioso Muniz. Both of them, and I don't know if separately or in any kind of collaboration with each other, moved to like the left of Trotskyism, right? So they both, I think Péret was more of like I think he might have been Brazilian French, I'm not sure. For some reason I have Brazil in my mind when I think of Péret. But like both of those surrealist figures moved to like the left of Trotskyism, and I think like Péret moves towards like a more like left communist orientation, whereas Breton becomes affiliated with like the Anarchist Federation in 1950s France before he dies. So that's a very André Breton's like political journey would be a super interesting thing to do some research on. There's a big biography of them that I'd like to read. I think it'd be super cool. Anyway. With regard to Marx's procedure, Gedelier outlined the connection between two methods which complement one another and yet which must be distinguished. On the one hand, a hypothetical deductive method, and on the other, a dialectical one. Gedelier argues that the dialectical method presupposes the hypothetical deductive one. Gedelier's approach has since been eclipsed by the more influential theoretical approach of Louis Althusser. The emergence of the Althusser school, with its orientation towards, quote, structuralism, occurred in the 1960s. The formation of this school marked an important watershed in the reception of Marx, not only within France, but also internationally. Yeah, and I'm like, that's another thing. It's like, what is the relationship of like Castoriadis and like and Rubel and all to Althusser? What did they have to say about him? What did Althusser have to say about like Rubel and stuff? I mean, I'm sure that the Althusser camp, as just like the camp within the Soviet bloc, would have referred to them as like bourgeois humanists or something like that. But it's a very fascinating thing. Also, I'm not sure about Gedelier's. I'm curious about Gedelier's politics, because I think there's an article. I might have an article by Gedelier on here, but Werner Bonafelt, who's definitely of like a council communist like orientation, like whatever, like a libertarian communist orientation. Definitely, who views like the council system or the rudiments of the council system as like the peak of the most worthwhile thing in the entirety of the 20th century. He has put an article by Gedelier in one of the Marx in one of the volumes that he edited. He edited a lot of volumes in the 2000s. But he had Gedelier in one of them, so I don't know what that means about Gedelier's politics, but I can't imagine Bonafelt including someone in his thing that was like some kind of even approaching Stalinist, much less Leninist. Approaching Leninist politics. Well, I guess he has people that are kind of quasi-Leninist or are less critical of it than he is. For instance, basically what I'm saying is I don't think Werner Bonafelt would include an essay by Althusser in something that he was editing. So what the politics of Gedelier is, I'm very curious about. Although I think he's mainly like an anthropologist. I think that's like kind of what his thing is. He wrote a big book on Levi-Strauss, I'm pretty sure. I think he did, at least. Where am I? It's beyond the scope of the present study to address Althusser's writings in the period before the 1960s. On the Althusser school, within and beyond France, see Wolff, 1994. And that's Frieder Otto Wolf, or whatever his name is. Anyway, where the hell am I? In the 1960s, Althusser pursued his project of establishing a new capital reading movement, together with his students Etienne Balibar, Jacques Rancière, Roger Establé, and Pierre Machery. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing any of these names right. Footnote. The text by Rancière, Establé, and Machery from the first edition of Lire la Capitale were omitted in the German language edition. I think they were also omitted in the English language edition as well, in the original one at least. Althusser's subsequent engagement with Marx's Capital has received somewhat less attention in the international Marx discussion. Footnote. The text by Rancière, Establé, and Machery from the first editions of Lire la Capitale were omitted from subsequent editions and also from English language editions. See, I know what I'm talking about. They're reinstated, however, in the forthcoming Verso English language edition and have already been restored in the recent German language edition. And footnote. Footnote. This text is Rancière's contribution to the first edition of Lire la Capitale. Footnote. A further theorist who moved within the orbit of the Althusser school was Nikos Palantzis. End footnote. Althusser put forward the principle of, quote, a symptomatic reading, end quote. And to my understanding of what a symptomatic reading is, like looking for, like, kind of trying to, to my understanding, is like kind of using the text to shed light on what is not said by the text. Kind of like what are some kind of like underlying premises or like gaps or something like that. I think the symptomatic reading comes from, to my understanding, something from like Lacanian psychoanalysis, but I'm taking a guess there. According to the French philosopher, such a reading was intended to detect the, quote, absent presence, end quote, in Marx's discourse, i.e. to take into account the fundamental preconditions of Marx's thought which, although not manifested textually, instead remaining implicit, are nonetheless absolutely constitutive. In the context of his philosophical approach based on, quote, structuralism, Althusser was thus concerned to expose the theoretical presuppositions of Marx's Capital. While Althusser himself engaged critically in the book Reading Capital with the problem of the object of the book Capital, Balibar addressed the basic question of the basic questions of historical materialism in the same work, whereas Althusser's student Establé focused on the problematic of the plans for the architectonic of capital. For his part, Rancière dealt with the critique of political economy as formulated in the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts, and then later in Marx's Capital. In his text on the problematic of Marx's exposition, Machery broached the question of the starting point of Marx's exposition of the critique of political economy in his magnum opus, considering in this context Marx's analysis of the commodity and his theory of value. To return to Althusser himself, an important idea of the French philosopher was the assumption of an epistemological rupture or break in Marx's work. Althusser thematized an alleged break in the history of Marx's work between let me reread that sentence, because he puts alleged in parentheses, which kind of would suggest that Hoff does not agree with this position at all. He's pretty, I don't know, it seems like he's been pretty open-minded thus far. I guess he's still open-minded, but what I'm saying is, like, if I don't know if it didn't seem like a necessary thing to put alleged in parentheses. Drawing attention to it. That's my symptomatic reading of Hoff's text right there. To return to Althusser himself, an important idea of the French philosopher was the assumption of an epistemological rupture or break in Marx's work. Althusser thematized an alleged break in the history of Marx's work between the earlier, quote, ideological or, quote, humanist works and the later, quote, scientific works. In the book For Marx, Althusser, strictly speaking, distinguishes four phases of Marx's work: his early writings up to 1844, the works dating from the turning point of 1845, which were decisive for the break, i.e. Theses on Feuerbach and the German ideology, the work during Marx's process of maturation up to 1857, and finally Marx's mature works from 1857 up to his death. Subsequently, Althusser held the view, at least temporarily in 1969, that the process by which Marx overcame the influence of Hegel's philosophy did not reach its conclusion until the final years of his life. According to Althusser, it was only in Marx's late works, i.e. among other writings in his Notes on Adolf Wagner's, quote, Lehrbuch der politischen Ökonomie, which was his last work on the critique of political economy, written a short time before his death, that he definitively concluded the process of overcoming the influence of Hegel's philosophy. So that's always a thing to keep in mind too when you're talking about thinkers, right? Is there is like, you know, there's always a desire for purposes of simplicity. You want to say so and so thought this at particular times. So that's kind of like so and so thought this, right? And just say Althusser's position was this. But it's always important to keep in mind that people's positions change and alter. So it seems like most people have their idea, the epistemological break, and these books being so famous, that was kind of the last word on Althusser, which was just shown by Hoff. This was not the case, and I think this is also shown in the book that I have on this channel, The Detour of Theory, by Gregory Elliott about Althusser. I think that this is important. Also, Althusser is kind of always characterized as like a structuralist, but it seems kind of like, I don't know, depending on like, that also depends on what period, because like he tries to establish Marxism as kind of like a science. That's his like a main thing, his like main thesis in his early periods, to describe Marxism as a science and kind of remove the subject from the analysis of capital, right? And that kind of seems like the big thing of structuralism. But by the end of the 1960s, you get that, to my understanding, he moves way more in a sense of like to the position that like class struggle is the fundamental, is more fundamental, in some sense more fundamental than structure, or like doesn't really emphasize, doesn't really try, and it doesn't seem like he really and this is a difficult thing in the history of ideas too, is like people change positions without critiquing their previous position, right? So it seems like he doesn't like, disown anything he does, but kind of moves into the direction. I mean, maybe he disowns some of it. Maybe I'm just not aware of it, but I got the impression at least that he moves to this very like class struggle-y focused position after being so ardently structuralist, which seems kind of like, maybe it's not contradictory, but it seems like there's more 100% attention between like a purely scientific structuralist orientation and a class struggle orientation, or a which emphasizes politics and thinking and human beings in like real contested in contest over whatever, right? There's definitely like a distinction there, some tension there, and it doesn't seem like he necessarily overcame that. I think probably, and this is my personal opinion, and I'm sure other people have said this, I can't be the only person who thinks this, it seems like the influence the influence of Maoism in this period, and the superficial anti-Stalinism of Chinese Stalinism has like an influence on this, right? Like Mao, and Eliot kind of speaks on this a bit. It's like Mao's Stalinism, Mao's quote-unquote Marxism was, despite appeals to the authority of science, right? Like Marxism must be a science in order to give it the kind of authority as like an ideology of legitimation of a particular regime, right? And that's one of the problems, that's one of the points that I think you should be rightfully kind of grossed out by the idea of scientific Marxism, because it's precisely for that reason of it's a science, is used as like an appeal to the, is used as like a, you can't dispute science. You can't question science. The science is science, right? And it's kind of like a legitimating ideology. So on the one hand, while being committed to the notion that Marxism is a science, and thus capitalism in some sense is oriented towards, it has demonstrated that it must be the case that socialism comes after capitalism, or something like that, or like a very determinist, like moving along the developmental evolution, with a evolution and revolution. Despite that kind of scientific approach, or like the scientific appeals, there's an intensive appeal to like an irrationalist, in my view, and deadly irrationalist view of like just like the will, the socialist, the ideological will of the people, quote, the people, being able to basically accomplish anything on earth. So there's kind of like this ultra-voluntarism mixed with this dogmatic scientism kind of mix that's like exists as a tension within that whole body of thought. And I think Althusser is influenced by that. I think he's very influenced. I think it seems to me, at least, I get the impression that he's very influenced by things like the Great Leap Forward and also by the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, so-called. And like a lot of people in France, especially, and the world over, but I think especially in France, are very, very much insufficiently critical of China. And when it kind of blows up in their face, like a lot of like the left, large sections of the radical left kind of disintegrate. Right? Althusser kills his wife. Sartre dies. Benny Levy and Andrei Glucksmann, both very ardent Maoists, become like Cold Warrior human rights people, like right-wing Cold Warrior kind of types, anti-totalitarians that are kind of like liberal capitalism is the best that's on hand. And anything that would suggest anything being superior to that is Stalinist fascist or something like that. So it kind of like explodes in this period, so when Maoism kind of implodes on itself, and the contradictions of its foreign policy become manifest, especially with the approachment with the United States, and friendly relationships with Pinochet's Chile, different fucking things. His support for Pol Pot, before the genocide in Cambodia really comes to the surface. Any of those kinds of things, like prior to that institution, when like Maoism kind of implodes as a beacon in some sense for at least large portions of the left to like have something of a brain. In France, it kind of destroys large sections of the left. And I think that it seems to me like Althusser's changing position is very much kind of influenced by, at least that was the impression I got from the Eliot book, is very much influenced by the voluntarism of Mao Zedong thought. So that would explain why he, trying to, Marxism is science, and the subject's dead, but class struggle is the most important thing, and class struggle's, scientific, or is it, or what? I don't know. It seems like, basically, I'm going way off here. I was supposed to be reading this goddamn book, but I'm just thinking about what this brings to mind is just sort of like the attention, like Althusser's changing positions, somewhat of a moving target, hard to pin down. What is his legacy proper? What is the Althusserian position? Because there's diversity within his output. I feel like I had another thought there. The diversity of his output. So it's hard to like pin him down, right? and what is, if he remains a structuralist, what is the changing contours of this structuralism? I mean, that's a difficult thing. And also, when you're talking about people like him that are operating at such a high theoretical altitude and using, and especially when they, it seems like a lot of things in continental philosophy, play loose with terminology, don't really try to set out from any kind of, reject kind of the axiomatic style of analytic philosophy of defining terms and building out and shit like that, and kind of deducing the implications of it. So it seems like it's kind of for one, it's hard to know what he's actually, for me at least, maybe I'm just dumb, but it's hard for me to know exactly what he is saying at any given point. And two, it changes. So it's hard to pin down what he's saying. So it's hard to even talk about what is structuralism and what is Althusserianism. And this applies to other people as well, but I'm getting off track here. But basically, it seems like Althusser goes through some changes, that are big changes. Anyway, quote, the famous preface of 1859, a contribution to the critique of political economy, is still profoundly Hegelian evolutionist. The quote, Grundrisse, are themselves profoundly marked by Hegel's thought. For in 1858, Marx had reread the Great Logic with amazement. When Capital Volume 1 appeared in 1867, traces of the Hegelian influence still remained. Only later did they disappear completely. The critique of the Gotha program, 1875, as well as the marginal notes on Wagner's Lehrbuch der politischen Ökonomie, bracket, which Althusser dates as having been written in 1882, end bracket, are totally and definitively exempt from any trace of Hegelian influence, end quote. I'm not sure when... I'm not sure when the actual... He says he claims 1882. Does that mean it's not from 1882? Anyway, that goes from Althusser. And this is kind of a distinction. People say there's kind of a question in this book and elsewhere about did Althusser's project have an influence on some of the Frankfurt School influence readings of Marx that happened in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Backhaus, Schmidt, so on and so forth. Reichelt. And this is something that's very different, is that for those people, the lack of Hegelianism, Marx trying to simplify his method, trying to popularize his method, trying to take out some of the cut the Hegelian language, cut the Hegelian connections out, resulted in something of a bastardization of Marx's of his own project, a kind of mutilation of it, making it perhaps more easy to digest, but kind of mutilating its theoretical power. So that's something very different between the Althusser school and the Neue Marx-Lektur. They're no, he made a mistake by cutting the Hegel out. It seems like Althusser is he made a mistake for keeping the Hegel in. And in fact, I think, to my understanding, Althusser encouraged people, just skip the first 3 chapters of Capital, just jump right into section 4, because the rest of it is Hegelian bullshit or something like that. I think, maybe I'm wrong about that, maybe that's too much of a simplification, but it seems like he's fuck those opening chapters. Alongside the inspirational effect that the Althusserian school had on the French debate, as well as on French theoretical currents beyond the interpretation of Marx in a narrow sense, the influence that it exerted in Latin America and the Anglo-Saxon world was considerable. Each of these regions formed their own respective branches of this current. Footnote: Graham Locke provides a survey of British Althusserianism, 1977. The U.S. reception of Althusser has also been registered in France. See Balibar, 1990. End footnote. In West Germany, Althusser encountered resistance from an early stage, even though he also had his supporters there. Footnote: In general, Alfred Schmidt referred to Althusser in a way that was critical, but by no means exclusively negative. Ulrich Müller identifies a, quote, thoroughgoing revision of Marxism, end quote, at work in Althusser, and speaks of a, quote, attack on central components of Marxist thought, end quote. Rather few German interpreters of Capital make positive references to Althusser. However, two examples are Kosiba, 1979, and Wolf, 1983. I feel like I have a piece on here. What the hell is it called? I don't know, but it's by Wolf is referring to Friedrich Otto Wolf. Wolf. There's a piece on here called Marxism at its limits or limitations of something pertaining to Marxism and its barriers, or something like finite Marxism is what's called. It's finite Marxism is the piece by Friedrich Otto Wolff that I have on this channel, which was in a collection edited by Riccardo Bellifiore, and I think he is probably one of those people who's a little bit more influenced by Althusser. But Kosiba, Hermann Kosiba, I don't know what he predominantly writes on now, but Kosiba, I have a piece by him on this channel about Alfred Schmidt, and that's from the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory. So if you're interested in Schmidt, check that out. Anyway, end footnote. Among other factors, the dominance of, quote, autochthonous readings of Marx in the 1960s and 1970s, and to all intents and purposes up to the present, readings in which, moreover, emphatic and positive references to Hegel played an important role at times, prevented Althusserianism from becoming hegemonic in the German language discussion of Marx. Regarded as a whole, it is fair to say that Althusser's reading of Marx, together with its broad international reception, had conflicting effects. On the one hand, Althusser directed attention to the oft-neglected epistemological problematic and provided a concept, that of the, quote, theoretical field, which would subsequently be received and further developed by the approaches of Michael Heinrich on the the Heinrich-influenced South Korean No Won Kwok. On the other hand, Althusser had a negative impact with regard to the way in which determinate problems were viewed. In this context, an obvious instance is Althusser's problematic take on Marx's theory of fetishism, a theory to which the French philosopher was critically opposed. The latter's instruction to readers of Capital that they should not start with the first section on commodities and money, but they should skip ahead to the second section on the transformation of money into capital. Man, I know what I'm fucking talking about. I'm a fucking king. Must surely be considered a curiosity in the international history of readings of Capital. In relation to the undervaluation of Marx's theory of fetishism by Althusser, however, it should be added that the philosopher Etienne Balibar, whose roots lie in the Althusserian school, cast Marx's theory of fetishism in a better light in a study of Marx published in 1993, characterizing it in the following terms, quote, "It is not merely a high point of Marx's philosophical work, entirely integrated into his, quote, critical and, quote, scientific work, but one of the great theoretical constructions of modern philosophy," end quote. Balibar. Footnote. Balibar had engaged intensively with Marx's theory of fetishism. Space does not permit a consideration of the development of Balibar's conception of the problematic of fetishism here. Yeah, I'm very curious about Balibar's political development. I think that's something that I would like to know, or philosophical development, because he also wrote the introduction to Eric John Russell's book, Hegel and De Boer. I can't remember what the subtitle is. It's Why Everything Is As It Appears, or something like that. But he wrote the introduction to that, and it's I thought that was kind of interesting. I haven't read it yet, so I just know that it's there. I think that's very interesting because, he's associated with this very anti-Hegelian school. For one thing, that's one aspect of why it's interesting, and also two. De Boer, I can't imagine something more distinct than the Situationist International and the writing of De Boer, Society of the Spectacle, and the work of the Althusser School. Can't imagine more hostile opponents. because it's not always talked about like De Boer's politics, but he's definitely of like the libertarian. He's a libertarian communist. He's of the councilist tradition. I mean, that's what he like. I mean, this, to my understanding, is like that's what he values. That's like what his politics like overlaps with. Obviously, it wouldn't be interesting if he was just like another iteration of the council communist tradition, but that's kind of like definitely seems to be what he's drawing from. Anyway, in relation to the undervaluation of Marx's theory of fetishism by Althusser, however, it should be noted that the philosopher Etienne Balibar, whose roots lie in the Althusserian school, cast Marx's theory of fetishism in a better light in a study of Marx published in 1993, characterizing it in the following terms, quote, "It is not merely a high point of Marx's philosophical work, entirely integrated into his, quote, critical and, quote, scientific work, but one of the great theoretical constructions of modern philosophy," end quote. A few years after the publication of Lire la Capitale, 1965, the swelling wave of Western European reception of the Grundrisse also reached France. Footnote. See, for example, Saint-Brun, 1968. In a later study, Henri Denis devoted a great deal of attention to the Grundrisse and to the text of a contribution to the critique of political economy, which had become available in French translation by 1957, if not earlier. On the French reception of the Grundrisse, see Tussell, 2008c. End footnote. This manuscript first appeared in French translation in 1967 to 68. However, Althusser's central focus was not this text, but rather capital. I feel like I've heard places... I was about to say exactly what I'm about to say. I said, I've heard that Althusser never read the Grundrisse, or never engaged with it. Despite being alive after its French publication for 20 years. Obviously, he kind of drops out to some extent out of philosophy in the 1980s, but I think he's still writing a bit. But yeah, it says the philosopher, continuing on, the philosopher Lucien Sèvres levels a serious charge against Althusser. Quote, Althusser never read the Grundrisse in the strong sense of the word, except for several texts from this manuscript, such as the 1857 introduction, of course, on which he wrote some notable sections, end quote. The veracity of Sèvres' assertion cannot be assessed here. In the more recent French debate on Marx, Jacques Bidet has critically engaged with the theoretical approach which he argues has been adopted by both French and international thinkers, including Italian, Japanese, and German ones. For Bidet, this approach consists in these theorists, quote, seeking the truth of Marx's Capital in the texts that precede Capital, these being characterized by a far more intensive use of concepts drawn from the Hegelian tradition in Marx's elaboration of the theory of capitalism, end quote. It might be added that it is especially the Grundrisse manuscript, together with the latter's international reception, and its significance for a, quote, Hegelianizing interpretation of Marx. With regard to this latter aspect, recall the work of the Japanese philosopher and economist Hiroshi Uchida, which ought to be borne in mind in this context. I think Hiroshi Uchida wrote a book called Marx's Grundrisse and Hegel's Logic. I think he wrote something like that. I read it at one point, but I don't remember it at all. Sometimes you crash course things. So like when I read the Grundrisse, I was reading a bunch of secondary literature on it, and he was one of the things that I read, and I don't remember that much of it in particular. The discussion around Althusser's theoretical interventions developed soon after the publication of Pour Marx and Lire la Capitale, For Marx and Reading Capital. However, criticisms of Althusser's theoretical output were also voiced by French Marxists. In his own interpretation of Marx, which he presented in the early 1960s, Paul Bocara addressed the problematic of Marx's plans for the architectonic of the critique of political economy. Bocara preferred a logico-historical interpretation of the exposition in Capital. Quote, in order to explain the fact that both Marx's Capital and Marx's A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy begin with the commodity, it is not sufficient to state that the commodity is the economic form of the product, and thus the connection between all economic relations, the, quote, most fundamental, end quote, entity in economic life, end quote. Bocara continues as follows, quote, above all, it must be recognized that commodity production precedes capitalist production historically. and forms the latter's point of departure. Accordingly, the historical starting point also constitutes the logical starting point." End quote. In this context, Picard's reading points in a direction similar to that taken by Engels' deficient interpretation of Marx's method, an interpretation which, despite its problematic content, exerted a great influence on traditional Marxism. So for instance, just to give an example of that influence, in Chris Arthur's book on, or not book, but article on the myth of simple commodity production, which is on this channel and is very good, he speaks of how he says the main prompt for him writing it, I think this is in like the early 1990s, maybe the late 1980s, but I think the early 1990s, he says, Ernest Mandel, in one of like the most recent reference books for Marxism, or maybe for just economics in general, speaks of the opening chapters of Capital being about a society, a simple commodity producing society. So Mandel being one of, like, in addition to Althusser, being probably one of the most important Marx interpreters of the post-war period, deep post-war period, like, the long post-war period of the latter half of the 20th century, he held on to the so-called logico-historical reading that was initiated by Engels. This it had a very extreme had a very extreme influence. Now, I feel as though, however, perhaps generalized commodity production and the necessity of generalized commodity production and the reduction of the direct producers within a society to market dependence, whatever Marx's theory of capitalism is, or what he's doing in chapter volume 1, and I'm very much convinced that he's not doing the logical historical method. It is. I feel like historically it can be said that the existence of things called commodities and markets and money do precede capitalism historically. But again, I think Arthur makes this point, is like, that's not even the question. Not the question of whether or not there was such thing as a simple commodity producing society, which is debatable. That's just, at the very least, that's not what Marx is doing in the opening chapters of Capital, right? He's not providing like he's not doing like a logico-historical gloss on the development of capitalism or something like that. Regardless of whatever the actual case might be about whether something like a simple commodity-producing society actually existed, or whether or not, it's starting to rain, or whether or not, the historical veracity of the concept of simple commodity-producing society. That's just what Marx is not. It's not what Marx is doing here. I think that's I think that's important. Is that whatever the history of it, that's just simply not what Marx is doing. Let me see if I can finish this chapter. Is it raining or is it just windy and water's blowing off the trees? I can't tell. In the French debate on Marx of the 1970s, Michel Vadet engaged with the development of the critical theory of abstraction over the historical course of the elaboration of Marx's work, while Francois Ricci attempted, in his investigation into the logical structure of the beginning of the exposition in Capital, to distinguish between different levels in Marx's thought. In 1967, Susan de Brunhoff had already published a much-cited study on the theories of money and credit in Marx's critique of political economy. At the end of the 1970s, the economist Gerard Duménil presented an interpretation of the critique of political economy in which he focused on the elaborating the concept of economic law to be found in Marx's magnum opus. In this study, Duménil aims to identify the specific logic of Marx's thought in Capital. Further, a 2-volume work first published in 1976 by the non-Marxist philosopher Michel Henry contains an interpretation both of Marx's early works and his mature critique of political economy. Henry establishes a fundamental separation between the thought of Karl Marx and Marxism. I have the opening chapter of one of Henry's books on this channel. Gerard Dumenil, I don't know, is he associated with like the regulation school? I'm not sure. But he has an article, I can't remember the book in, but I have a chapter on here about, he's done a lot of work, I think, about like the role of management in capital, in like the book Capital and also in capitalist society. But I'd like to read that very much so, because I have a piece on here, I think it was written in the same book that Paresh Chattopadhyay had a thing about how Marx kind of like talked about bureaucratization. A lot of times when Marxists talk about bureaucracy, they're talking about like political entities, right? They're talking about, the state or whatever. And that's kind of what, if you think of, for instance, like Trotsky, right? He doesn't talk, him and Lenin and a lot of those people kind of viewed bureaucracy within the production apparatuses as taken for granted. And that's kind of like, and they kind of draw their sources from like Engels on authority, about like the necessarily hierarchical nature of modern production, and that just needs to be accepted as like a fact of life. Whereas Paresh Chattopadhyay kind of makes the argument that no, this is not Marx's critique of bureaucracy extends to the critique of bureaucracy in production, and has like has substantial things to say about it. And I think Gerard Dumenil, I don't think he's like arguing the same thing, but he talks about the role of like, the certain very important topics within the critique of political economy, about the bifurcation between ownership and management, which obviously has big implications for about like, the Russian question and so on and so forth. But I really like to read that piece if I ever get a chance to, or like just know more about his shit, because I think it's that name is a name you see a lot. In his study, Dumenil aims to identify the specific logic of Marxist thought in Capital. Further, a 2-volume work first published in 1976 by the non-Marxist philosopher Michel. I already read that. Following Jacques Ranciere's presentation in his 1965 contribution to Lire le Capital, a reading of Marx through the theory of fetishism, and Pierre Macheret's considerations on the problem of the beginning of the exposition in Marx, the intensive engagement with Marx's theory of fetishism, with his value form theory, and with the, quote, beginning of Capital, gained fresh impetus in the 1970s. A significant contribution in this context came from Paul-Dominique Dognin, who produced an edition of and commentary on the beginning of the first volume of Capital, including the value form analysis from the 1867 first edition of Marx's work. Knowledge of this later text is of decisive significance for the interpretation of the historical development of Marx's theory of value. Yet it was little known within the French debate until that point. From the 1970s to the 1990s, in particular, an important current within Marx interpretation began to develop. The theorist Jean-Marie Vincent, who died in 2004, was one of the French interpreters of Marx to adopt a stance on Marx's theory of the fetish, which sharply contrasted with Althusser, who, as indicated above, underrated this theory. Now, to my understanding, Jean-Marie Vincent is one of the first people, is a very important person, I think, in France, so far as I think he was one of the first people in France to adopt, to kind of like, obviously there's Marcuse and people like that who have a thing, but like was kind of important to like making critical, Frankfurt School critical theory kind of relevant within certain quarters of French left theoretical life. And I think he wrote a book called A Critique of Abstract Labor, and I think some people have made the argument that he's kind of like a certain, and I don't know about the relationship between them and actually, but certain kind of like French iteration of like value critique people, which is not the same thing as value form analysis, but value critique people. So like people like Robert Kurtz or like Ernst Lohoff or what the hell is her name? Roswitha Schultz, I think might be her name. Like those kind of people who are associated with the journals like Crisis and Exit. I have pieces from both of those circles on this channel. Obviously, Anselm Joppa is also kind of part of that current. And I suppose there's people, an English publication of a bunch of their works on this that's available in English. It's edited by someone. Is it like Josh or John Robinson or something like that? I think was the editor of it. But I think Jean-Marie Vincent, I don't know how you say that name in French. Vincent is probably how you pronounce it. That's my guess. He's kind of like a French version of that, right? So, of that kind of school. I've heard that. I'm not particularly sure. That might not exactly be the case. But anyway. The theorist Jean-Marie Vincent, who died in 2004, was one of the French interpreters of Marx to adopt a stance on Marx's theory of the fetish, which sharply contrasted with that of Althusser, who was indicated above underrated this theory. Vincent opened up a perspective of Marx's critique of political economy, which is acutely focused on the theory of fetishism. Within the French reception of Marx, one of the most elaborate texts to be produced by the fetish-informed theoretical interpretive current is a central work by Tran Hai Hak, which will be considered in more detail below. The emergence of this interpretive tendency ought to be understood as marking decisive theoretical progress in the French discussion of Marx. The recent approaches of Antoine Artaud and Alain Beer attest to the fact that the form and fetish theoretical interpretation continues to be pursued further within the French reception of the critique of political economy. So it'd be cool to check those people out. There's a footnote here. Ingo Elba, I haven't been in pieces from Ingo Elba on this channel. Ingo Elba gives an extensive and appreciative consideration of Rancière's contribution. Elba credits the French thinker with having broken in his interpretation of Marx with the traditional understanding of Marx's exposition as a, quote, logico-historical one, an understanding which can be traced back to Engels' interpretation. End footnote. So yeah, there's a footnote that I missed. Yeah, so, let me see. Yeah, so, where am I? It's worth mentioning here that the publication of the Mega 2 edition from the 1975 onward was noted within French engagement with Marx in the 1980s. To cite an example, the French specialist in German philology and translator of Capital, Jean-Pierre Lefebvre, addressed the Mega 2 edition. With regard to French engagement with Marx since the 1980s in general, however, it is above all the important contribution to the reception of Marx's critique of political economy in the shape of the theory developed by Jacques Bidet, which merits consideration here. In the 1980s, Bidet, together with Jacques Teixeira, founded the journal Actuel Marx, a significant periodical which played an important role in familiarizing the French public with the debate on Marxism in Japan, China, Italy, the Anglo-Saxon world, and elsewhere. In this journal, attention was also and continues to be paid to the German discussion of Marx. Footnote. For instance, a recent contribution by Michal Kretka affords an insight into the latter phase of Marx's engagement with the critique of political economy. An example of an important, quote, autochthonous contribution is by Emmanuel Renan. In the context of a consideration of the critical character of Marx's theory, Renan investigates the various critical perspectives and types of critique in the young and mature Marx. End footnote. Although Bidet's own theoretical contributions have certainly been registered in Germany, there has been a more intensive reception of them elsewhere. Jacques Bidet's study, Que faire du capital, was first published in 1985. Despite its title, this work by no means refers to Capital alone. The object of this study by the French interpreter of Marx is the critique of political economy as presented in the form of Marx's text on the period between 1857 and 1875. Of note in this context are, alongside the Grundrisse, the 1861-63 manuscripts, which contain theories of surplus value, the so-called 1863 to 1865 manuscripts, the first and second German editions of the first volume of Capital, and the French edition of the latter, published in 1872 to 75. Although the chronological time frame demarcated here falls within Marx's, quote, mature period, Bidet finds that it is nonetheless marked by a series of breaks. Since its publication, Que faire du capital is considered within the international discussion of Marx to be a standard work, and has been published in Serbo-Croat, Japanese, Korean, and English. Footnote: the English version of Que faire du capital was published under the title Exploring Marx's Capital, Philosophical, Economic, and Political Dimensions. And that's what I have that book. It's with the Historical Materialism book series. And again, I don't really remember it that well. Anyway, moving on. Bidet's further theoretical development since the first edition of Que faire du capital cannot be considered here in any detail. It is sufficient to note that in the meantime, Bidet's approach has evolved in the direction of an extension and fundamental, quote, refoundation of Marxian theory. A more recent text by the French theorist outlines his attempt over the last few years to draw on Marx himself in order to go beyond Marx. Footnote: this essay provides a summary of some important reflections contained in the book Explication et Reconstruction du Capital. End footnote. The logic of the exposition in Marx's Capital is interpreted by Bidet as a dialectic on three levels. Firstly, the level of, quote, metastructure or presupposition. Secondly, the level of, quote, structure. And thirdly, the level of, quote, practices. According to Bidet, the object of the first section of Marx's Capital is universal and abstract, i.e. it is itself the, quote, metastructure. For the French theorist, this metastructure consists in a society which, in the final analysis, is formed by commodity producers, who mutually recognize each other as free, equal, and rational agents in the exchange of their commodities. Nonetheless, the, quote, metastructure, corresponding to the commodity form, is ultimately posited and generalized by the capitalist, quote, structure. The tradition from money to capital, which is executed in Marx's Capital, is taken by Bidet to be one from, quote, metastructure to, quote, structure. The level of, quote, structure encompasses the class relations of capitalist society. The class relations of capitalist society. The latter were disregarded at the level of, quote, metastructure. The, quote, structure is in turn reproduced by, quote, practices through the process of capitalist production. In his 2006 essay, Bidet criticizes the beginning of Marx's exposition. He argues as follows, quote, as plausible as the beginning of the exposition might seem, it can be criticized for the, quote, one-sided or, quote, unipolar character that it exhibits when in fact two poles are to be considered, end quote. Bidet. Thus, Bidet refers to, on the one hand, the, quote, market form, and on the other, the, quote, form of organization. Quote, the, quote, form of organization, end quote, has a character which is equally as abstract as the, quote, market form, and which is likewise presupposed by the ensuing analysis. The fact that Marx only discovers organization in the fourth section of the first volume of Capital and deals with it under the rubric of, quote, cooperation is utterly disconcerting, end quote. Bidet. Bidet maintains that the beginning of the exposition needs to be expanded so as to encompass both poles. Bidet's 2004 monograph, Explication et Reconstruction du Capital, represents a continuation of his reading of Capital. The perspective opened up by Bidet in this work is that of, on the one hand, an explanation of Marx's Capital, and on the other, a reconstruction of Marx's magnum opus. Here the French theorist sets out his critique of Marx for the latter's one-sided focus on the market dimension at the beginning of Marx's Capital, which leads him to somewhat neglect the dimension of organization at this point. Bidet is not content merely to provide a reconstruction in the sense of a, quote, correction. Rather, his reconstruction envisages, above all, a, quote, expansion. Marx's Capital can only, quote, tackle the question it presents on condition of being reconstructed on an expanded basis, according to the twin, quote, poles of the metastructure, bracket, the poles of market and organization, in bracket, and its twin, quote, aspects, economic and legal political, end quote. Within the German-speaking countries, there has not, as yet, been a properly broad reception of the theory formed by Bidet over approximately the last decade. New section. Other Western European countries. In Scandinavia, above all, a Danish theoretical current deserves to be highlighted as an independent approach to the interpretation of Marx's critique of political economy, even though the effects of the West German discussion of Marx formed the background to the emergence of this current in the 1970s. The, quote, capital logic tendency developed in Denmark at this time under the influence of the West German New Marx reading. For instance, Hans-Jürgen Schanz developed an independent theoretical position which was influenced by Reichhelt's doctoral thesis, but also by Rosdolsky's monograph, and was marked by the impact of the wave of reception of the Grundrisse of the 1960s and 1970s. According to Vesa Oitinen, quote, a further representative of Danish capital logic, bracket, alongside Hans-Jürgen Schanz, was Anders Lundqvist, who, like Schanz, is also closely aligned to Reichelt, end quote. Oitinen, 2008. You see this person's name a lot, this Oitinen person. I forget they edited something important. Let me look at this. Sorry, let me look at this, the endnotes here. Yeah, they wrote something with Paula Rahala, Evald Ilankov's Dialectics of Abstract and Concrete, and the recent value form debate, and that's in Dialectics of the Ideal, Evald Ilyankov, and Creative Soviet Marxism, edited by Alex Levant and Vesa Oitinen. So yeah, that's where I recognize them from. Paula Rahala, I don't know how to pronounce the name properly, has a piece on here. It's very rich in history, rich in kind of context, which I really like. She also wrote a longer piece about like reading Marxism in the two Germanys, but she basically makes the argument that because there was so much prosperity in late 60s Germany, that Frankfurt School influenced readings of Marx were almost basically in the privileged position to concern themselves with fetishism, whereas, and so therefore, but as opposed to surplus value, which I think is ridiculous. I think I think it's like they still concern themselves with exploitation and so on and so forth. Had the privilege basically of concerning themselves with value form theory and fetishism, whereas since that time, since the decline of prosperity, since the collapse of Keynesianism, since the introduction of neoliberalism, traditional Marxism, which doesn't focus on fetishism, which it seems like almost in her eyes is something of a waste of time, and has again been concerned with surplus value, which again the questions of surplus value and exploitation have once again returned to their prominence. And so there should basically be a return to traditional Marxism and a step away from value form analysis and fetish critique, and so just return to like a more orthodox reading of Marx, which just seems like so flawed on so many levels, as if exploitation stopped happening in the 1960s. And only in the wave of neoliberalism did exploitation happen again, become relevant to the capitalist mode of production, or that that you have to make some kind of choice between more empirical analysis of exploitation or like theoretical analyses of exploitation, and you in order to do that, you have to kind of abandon engagement with the insights of Frankfurt School critical theory. So she weighs essentially the Neue Marx lecture. She tries to kind of have this semblance of just being kind of somewhat open, but she's definitely a critic of New Marx reading in favor of traditional Marxism. She kind of like puts she says that basically the orthodox readings in Stalinist GDR were more worthwhile than the Neue Marxlektur at the same time, right? And that's ostensibly because they were trying to do some kind of economic reforms in GDR, which I don't know why would, especially considering the GDR, which was supposed to be this, supposed to be a socialist society. Why would surplus value, the questions of surplus value and exploitation be, of more concern there than anywhere else? But she does emphasize that certain people, and I think this is kind of common within the Eastern Bloc, did start to become more interested in value form theory and fetish critique. And it seems like there's not really like I feel like it's and basically that article provides some really interesting historical context, and I'm sure her larger monograph is also that way, but her conclusions seem so off base to me. It seems like but check out that piece. So I'm probably going to read her book very soon after I'm done reading this one again, because it is extremely rich in detail, like the intellectual context, whatever you think of her opinions. Just like I'm sure you'd get a lot out of reading this book, this Jan Hoff book, even if you don't agree with his with the kind of pride of place that he gives to questions of value theory and fetishism, and so on and so forth. Check out her piece. But that's kind of what I know Rahala from. Rahala. I'm not sure how to say that name. But anyway, check that out. Where the hell am I? The, quote, capital logic tendency adopted a critical stance towards another current within the Danish debate on Marxism, which attempted to draw on Louis Althusser. Footnote. An insight into the Danish debate around Althusser and capital logic is afforded by Schmidt, 1977. End footnote. Foregrounded within the Danish, quote, capital logic discourse were the programmatic commitment to a project of reconstruction of Marx's critique of political economy and the development of approaches to form and fetish theoretical reading of Marx. In this way, the Danish, quote, capital logic discourse, and, quote, shared features of the West German debate around Hans-Georg Bachhaus and others. Footnote, a relatively high level of familiarity with Bachhaus's early works is in evidence in the Scandinavian discussion. End footnote. Formerly a sizable intellectual constellation, quote, capital logic, went into decline from the 1980s on, even though Danish interpreters of Marx have continued to engage with Marx's method in his critique of political economy and the problematic of the value form until the recent past. In Germany, the discourse of Danish, quote, capital logicians has hardly been registered, despite its thematic intersection with parts of the West German debate, and despite the fact that there is potential for connections to be established between these two discussions in terms of their content. Footnote. The East German philosopher Peter Rubin did at least mention Schanz's above-mentioned book in an article. See Rubin, 1977. End footnote. By contrast, the Danish, quote, capital logic tendency subsequently engaged in a reception of further approaches to research within the orbit of the West German, quote, New Marx reading, such as those by the German-Australian working group, the Sydney Constance Project. And I have like a chapter in the introduction, the long forward, I guess, preface, or whatever you want to call it, by Michael Eldred to his book. I can't remember what it's called. Probably has it right here. Critique of Competitive Freedom and the Bourgeois Democratic State, Outlines of a Form Analytical Extension of Marx's Uncompleted System, which apparently was originally published in Copenhagen. So that's interesting. Any hooser. Footnote. Finally, some general references in Scandinavian engagement with Marx can be provided here. On the publishing history of Marx's works in Denmark, see Callison, 1987. A more recent Danish study on Marx's critique of political economy has appeared in German. Is, I think, Zoran Mao, who wrote that book, Impersonal, what's it called? Mute Compulsion, is also from Denmark. The question of the relation between the logical and the historical is also thematized in Finland in the 1980s. Since its establishment in Finland in 1997, a quote, Marx Society, Karl Marx Soira, has functioned as a scientific association. Probably the best known work of Swedish research into Marx Engels is Motsatssternas spel, Friedrich Engels' Philosophy och 1800-talets Vetenskaper, the play of contradictions, Friedrich Engels' Philosophy of Science of the 19th Century. Friedrich Engels' Philosophy and the Science of the 19th Century by Sven Erik Liedman, which was the focus of much attention after it was first published in 1977. An abridged German version exists. In this work, Liedman refers to Marx's 1857 introduction, which contains the famous, quote, chapter on method. A Norwegian author, Jørgen Sandemoser, also addresses Marx's 1857 introduction. I know Jørgen Sandemoser's reference. I think he's referenced in van der Linden's Western Marxism and the Soviet Union as well. One of the things that I do know, and I don't know about Scandinavia in general, but I know like the Scandinavian 68, I think it's in Norway at least, never really had like an anti-authoritarian phase. Like it seems like the student movement there immediately became infatuated with third worldist Marxism, Leninism, that kind of thing, Maoism, that kind of stuff. Very early on, the most authoritarian, disgusting interpretations of radical politics you could have. So it would make sense. It seems like the milieu in Germany is a little bit different, or was a little bit different, and so it seems like it might have hampered. I don't know. There's no reason for that to hamper Marx research necessarily, but it seems like it could, especially if what you're attempting is a non-dogmatic reading or like a new reading of some kind that isn't hemmed in by like orthodoxy. That could be irrelevant. Check out the pieces by some pieces by New Compass Press, which I don't know if it still exists, but it was kind of part of like the international like social ecology world, like around that was steeped in the works of Marie Bookchin, which told me that there's like which has pieces about the Norwegian radical left scene there. So yeah, check that out. It says, for a sophisticated recent Swedish engagement with the Neue Marx lecture, see Ramsey. I'm not sure who this is referring to. It says Ramsey, but I think it's Anders Ramsey who wrote the entry into the Sage Handbook of Frankfurt School Critical Theory on positivism. I think he's written interesting shit on Marx, but I'm not an expert. Anyway, in Switzerland, a critical engagement with Marx's method and his critique of political economy began shortly after the Second World War. In the 1970s, the new 1970 edition of Otto Morph's study, an appendix was added on the Grundrisse, which had first been made accessible to a wider readership beyond the Soviet Union through the East Berlin edition of 1953. Footnote. With the exception of its expanded appendices, this edition is based on the original 1951 edition. End footnote. Here, although he is aware of the provisional and experimental character of this rough draft, Morph understands the Grundrisse as, quote, methodologically the most revealing connection between the early and late works, unquote, of Marx. The Swiss theorist especially thematizes the specific interconnections between the categories of capital, landed property, and wage labor, which are to be expounded in the first 3 volumes of Marx's 6-volume plan. Morph considers these 3 to be the most important. In the 1970s, Anton Fischer, a further Marx interpreter from Switzerland, produced a work in which he regarded Marx's analysis of the capitalist mode of production as a form analysis. Anton Fischer addressed the problematic of fetishism theorized by Marx and devoted attention to Marx's analysis of the value form, among other questions. A more recent Swiss contribution focuses on a section of the 1857 Introduction, a text which preceded Marx's work on the Grundrisse. The Swiss commentary on Marx's quote, chapter on method, end quote, presented by Judith Janowska, Martin Bondelli, Konrad Kindler, and Mark Hofer in the 1990s, has been noted in Germany, at least within specialist circles, and in general ranks among the most important German language contributions to the methodological discussion of Marx. Arguably, the standard work represents the most ambitious investigation of the, quote, chapter on method, not only within German language research, but within international research as a whole. Footnote: the investigation of Marx's quote, chapter on method, end quote, had already played an important role in Otto Morph's work. End footnote. This historical and systematic commentary of Marx's text will be considered at greater lengths below. Since the 1990s, a notable level of research activity on Marx's critique of political economy has been developed around the Greek theoretical journal Thesis. The specialist readership in German-speaking countries is no doubt acquainted with this research activity, at least to some extent as a result of the contributions of its most important representatives to German-language publications, John Milios, Dimitri Dimoulis, George Economakis, compiled their most important studies in 2002, making them available to an international readership in the form of a monograph. I think this might be called Karl Marx and the Classics, but I'm not sure. A number of the approaches presented in this work are influenced by the Althusserian school, and particularly by Michael Heinrich's interpretation of Marx. In the interpretation of these Greek theorists, Marx's critique of political economy is fundamentally distinguished from political economy itself. On this reading, Marx transcended the, quote, theoretical field, end quote, of political economy, brought about, quote, the formation of a new theoretical domain, end quote, and developed a specifically monetary theory of value, centering on the internal interconnection between the theory of value and the theory of money. The status of money should be emphasized here. Quote, the Marxian analysis does not, entail reproduction of the barter model, since it holds that exchange is necessarily mediated by money. This amounts to a monetary theory of the capitalist economy, a monetary theory of value, since money is interpreted as an intrinsic and necessary element in capitalist economic relations, end quote. And that's from C. Milios, Demiolis, and Economakis, 2002. Milios understands Marx's labor theory of value as a monetary theory of value, which implies a radical break with and a radical critique of David Ricardo's theory of value. Yet Milios et al. Argue in their monograph that there are in fact ambivalences in Marx's work, despite the fundamental theoretical advances that he makes beyond classical political economy. That's like a central Heinrich thesis. On their view, Marx falls back into a Ricardian value theoretical approach in dealing with determinate theoretical problems in his manuscripts, dating from the period between 1861 to 1865, i.e. he regresses to a kind of, quote, sophisticated version of the Ricardian political economy of value as, quote, labor expended, end quote, end quote. And yeah, and this is kind of like a thing is that one of the main things for Heinrich, at least, is that Marx kind of equivocates on what abstract labor is. On the one hand, it's a purely social substance that is specific to commodity production, whereas in other sections he just basically says it's just labor pure and simple, which has nothing to do with commodities necessarily. Which is, and so obviously most people say who follow the value form theory, Rubin and all, either they interpret Marx, they interpret this statement in their own way as being a vindication of the social reading, or they say that Marx, we agree with Heinrich, that Marx is kind of responsible for the confusion here. I don't know about this. I don't know about, like, there's probably differences here between what Heinrich has to say and what this kind of Greek value form theory school would say, or any of its particular members, not to say that they're all homogenous with each other. Anyway, the Greek authors maintain that these theoretical weaknesses of Marx's cannot be disregarded. Quote, every, quote, sanctifying attitude towards Marx, presenting him as the inculpable master, practically blurs the scientific and heuristic kernel of Marx's analysis, as it identifies it with the Ricardian element, present in some of his elaborations, end quote. The Greek theorists identify a categorical confusion in Marx's treatment of the problematic of the transformation of values into prices of production. Likewise, they also consider Marx's theory of ground rent to be deficient. Quote, Marx's analysis on ground rent, and especially the part of it on absolute ground rent, is one of the weakest points in his whole economic work, end quote. Alongside their exposition of the categorical structure of commodity money capital and their thoroughgoing critical engagement with the problematic of fetishism, and with themes from the third volume of Capital, Milius et al. Devote a great deal of attention to the crisis-theoretical dimensions of the critique of political economy. This is examined more closely in Part 3 of the present study. Okay, so that is the end of Section 5 of Chapter 2 of Jan Hoff's book, Marx Worldwide, on the development of the international discourse on Marx since 1965, translated by Nicholas Gray. Chapter 2 of the book, again, is titled The Further Development of the Marx Debate Since the 1960s, a Survey, and Section 5 was titled Italy, France, and Other Western European Countries, with the headings Italy, France, and Other Western European Countries. Thank you so much for listening. The next section is titled Latin America and Spain. Thank you so much for listening.